Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Today I'm sitting down with Dan Tannebaum. He's a partner at the consulting firm of Oliver Wyman and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I reached out to Dan because we've been doing a lot of discussions about what Trump's tariffs mean for the Indo-Pacific, what they mean for Japan, what they mean for Australia, etc. But I realized we haven't quite had an American perspective on this, which is why I wanted to invite Dan on the podcast. So Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, from where you're sitting, describe how the private sector in the United States, how private firms are internalizing and rationalizing everything that's happened so far. Does this make more sense to them than it does to us on the other side of the Pacific? Are they seeing something that we don't?
No. I think the challenge...
Okay, thanks for joining us today.
Look, I think the challenge is outside of a small cadre of people directly advising the president. I'm not sure that there's a wide amount of understanding of kind of what this administration is really looking to achieve. So the private sector, and I spend most of my days advising global financial institutions, automotive companies, aviation firms, consumer product manufacturers. I think there's been a lot of assessing that's been happening. The challenge that companies have, and this is where the paralysis is really setting in because of the mercurial nature of this president, for a company to upend their supply chain for someone who could change their mind 2 weeks later is ludicrous. And so you've got a lot of people waiting for any sort of clear air, for lack of a better phrase, that shows we have a course that we're going to stick to going forward. And absent that, you have a lot of firms that are really stuck, for lack of a better term. They just can't really make any meaningful strategic decisions. What I can say, and what isn't getting advertised as much, is I think the enthusiasm for investment in the U.S. market is a lot less than this administration appreciates. Because if you think about it, if you're a foreign company, why would you put more capital into the U.S. now only to have your quarter, your year ruined by a tweet for something that catches the attention of the administration?
Mm-hmm. I mean, to that end, though, tweets / Truth Social posts are one thing. How much stock do decision makers really put in those kinds of things? Because I've kind of been a stickler for the fact that, Trump is going to Truth Social post whatever he wants, but wait for the Federal Register, wait for the executive order before you really start trying to get your head around this stuff.
Oh, Paul, my friend. I mean, yes, you're right. And this is the challenge, that companies are taking policy as dictated by a Truth Social post that's then being pushed onto Twitter, because most companies will not go on Truth Social for any reason. But you're right. Like, that is the challenge, is Trump can say a lot of things. And the great example is when he announced, the Syria sanctions are lifted. No, they weren't. Like, the Syria sanctions were fully in effect up until yesterday, when he's largely just decided to not enforce the Caesar Act and repeal certain sanctions that were within his purview. That is the challenge, is that he'll say things that aren't actually bound or consistent with the law. But that is the policy that companies are obviously following, because what you're now seeing is the president says something like he announced last week that, China can keep buying Iranian oil. And it was like, that's still very illegal from a U.S. standpoint. And even talking to friends at the Treasury Department, they had no idea what he was talking about. But the reaction was, I guess we'll have to figure out how to create waivers for China to legally buy Iranian oil. So, no, companies don't fully appreciate the process of this. Isn't just the president, putting something out on social media. That, there is a rulemaking process that follows because of the way he's running this government now, where it really is being run by the center and not in the cabinet agencies anymore.
So to that point, where do people like Scott Bessent or Howard Lutnick come in? Again, sort of speaking from the outside, it would appear that at least Bessent seems to be a little bit more market rational. He seems to be the one that can sort of, I dare not say bring order to the chaos, but at least start to rationalize these things and get them on a more stable track. Is that fair? Is there anyone like this, or is this just completely...
I mean, if you're grading on a scale, Professor, then sure. I think that is a bit of the challenge we're dealing with now. You're right. There's no doubt that Secretary Bessent is probably the best blend of being able to speak Trump and also to markets in a way that doesn't blow up kind of like bond markets, for instance. That he is bringing calm to some of the instability in so much as he can. But let's be clear that a lot of these policy decisions are being made by Trump and those immediately around him. And that's not always the Secretary of Treasury nor the Secretary of Commerce. And so that I think where they play a role and where they both played a role after Liberation Day was trying to point out the obvious of you're destroying our economy with this policy because you're killing the Treasury markets. You're weakening the dollar, and not in a way that Stephen Meehan wanted to weaken. Like, this went way beyond anything that the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accords had really predicted. So I think in so much as anyone can be a stabilizing force, it's them. I also think, look, you have a president who's not bound by re-election, and despite all of the rhetoric of, serving a third term, which has kind of gone away. I mean, all of the guardrails he had in the form of a Steve Mnuchin and a General Mattis in the first term, they're all gone. Like, everyone had to pass a loyalty test. So even people I knew that served in the first term that wanted to serve in the second term, of the few that actually would go back, some of them were deemed insufficiently loyal. So, like, you're dealing with a cadre of people that really are following the company line here above all else.
But on the point about guardrails, it's kind of been assumed, rightly or wrongly, and I'm sure you'll tell me, which way it is. It's been assumed that once the tariffs go into place, tariffs are a tax, it's going to raise prices, people don't want to pay higher prices, that the public will start to turn against the tariffs pretty quickly. Do you think that's fair? I have a hunch, but I want to get your perspective. Do you think it's fair to assume that the public will turn against these tariffs once they see prices start to rise?
So I think it's even worse than that. Take a step back even further before we get to consumers. So I'm not even sure that investors, so you could argue more sophisticated consumers, even understand what's going on and how things are connected. A great example is when China a few months ago began limiting and ultimately restricting 27 rare earth elements to come to the U.S., the market didn't really react. Just last week, a large U.S.-based automotive company announced they had to shut down a handful of plants as a result of having limits on elements that they needed to make everything from batteries to windshield wipers. The market didn't react because investors aren't reading this. They don't understand that if China does this, we have to stop doing that. And so, if you think regular consumers understand the root cause of this, like the most sophisticated investors, I would argue, don't fully understand the connections. And I had a discussion with the CFOs of some of the largest banks in the U.S. last week. And one of them, a top 10 U.S. bank CFO, asked, well, how can it be so bad as you say the markets are doing great? And it was kind of like, did you ever think that maybe the market is not a great proxy for how things are going? You're literally unable to source things that are critical in your supply chain, and you may have a 6-month surplus. You don't notice this immediately. It takes maybe a year before on the shelves you ultimately can't source product. So this isn't something, unless you know what you're looking for, that you get. So forget about consumers. I don't think even the more sophisticated investment community fully understands the ramifications of some of these actions and the counter that other countries are doing.
Okay, that's kind of somehow even more grim than I expected, because you would you would assume that private companies, the private sector of all people, would understand risks to supply chains. That if you disrupt one node, you're going to get echoes throughout the system. And you're saying no?
Well, you're right, but that's at a company by company level. My point is, I don't know if the investment community, who invests in a whole host of different sectors, fully appreciate that. So yes, a large American automotive manufacturer clearly understands their supply chain, and all the way up and down the different tiers of suppliers and where they're sourcing raw material and the knock-on effect. My point is the investment community, where the markets are really muting the reaction of some of these moves that are a lot more significant than people realize. When China banned tungsten, where the U.S. gets 92% of it from China, that's a bit of a problem because it's used in a lot of things that we need here, and you literally can't get it from anywhere else.
So how do you introduce any kind of rationalism into the process? I mean, that's the $8 million question, but I mean, if you're in this environment and there's policy by tweets, there's, the unclear decision-making process, there is no process. If you are a company, if you're an investor, how do you start to get your head around everything that is happening, could be happening?
Well, you can't. I mean, that is the challenge. I mean, at some point, you need to follow your strategy, whatever it is, because, again, if you try to account for the moves of the U.S. government, and it's interesting, the Chinese government's new rhetoric over the last few months has largely been like, we're the stabilizing force and America's the disruptor. And you kind of look around, and it's hard to argue with that.
I mean, pot, kettle, black, but yeah, you're right. It's not misplaced.
They're a lot more predictable than the U.S. government is right now. You know what you're getting with them. You may not like it, but you know what you're getting. Here, you don't really know the policy moves from week to week. I mean, we went at Canada and Mexico first, where we shared land borders. I mean, this is not a traditional path. So for companies right now, I mean, honestly, I think they're trying to understand their significant exposure for those who may already have existing U.S. manufacturing. And I'm thinking of some of my existing automotive clients. They're pushing more production into their U.S. facilities to try and increase output here to offset a reduced output in other countries more significantly subjected to tariffs. But no one are building new factories in the U.S. We even analyzed a lot of the trade deals announced in the first term, and honestly, a lot of them resulted in just very little relative to what the top line numbers were. So, I'm not really seeing clients tripping over themselves to build new production facilities in this country, even if they're making all these announcements for capital investment. I honestly think no one's following up to see that they're even making good on it. So some may make these announcements and then not actually do anything.
So do you think Trump, in that sense, is genuine about wanting to bring manufacturing back to the U.S.? Because, I mean, this is not the way I would do it, but that seems to be so consistently messaged that you have to sort of take them at their word.
I think this has been a consistent theme for decades that Donald Trump thinks jobs should come back, manufacturing should come back to the U.S., which is ironic because everything he sells is made in China. I don't know if anything that is sold on his website is even made in this country. I'm sure there's something, but it's probably surprising. We're at full employment statistically. Who are taking these jobs? So are we going to go after the services sector and pull people out of that to get on a factory line? Americans don't want to work in factories. And Howard Lutnick with his tiny screw comment, no one is doing that here. It is too expensive. Apparel would be a t-shirt would be 10 times as much if you attempted to make it in this country. And Americans crave cheap crap. That is what they want. So I think he is genuine, but I also think he can you can say lots of things and make them true if you really believe it, like Santa Claus, for instance. So I think he can talk about the trillions that he brought back from the Middle East, but in reality, there's no money there's no checks that have been cut. I mean, these are IOUs in Dumb and Dumber. There's not real money behind some of these.
Okay, so to that, I mean, again, assuming that he's genuine, taking him at his word, you would think that attracting foreign direct investment would be a big part of that. You'd assume. Couple points on that. You can take them in, whichever order you want. One, when are we going to see the updated investment rules for foreign direct investment that were floated back in February? Two, Nippon Steel. How much of a, signal is that to other potential foreign investors that this is the way to go with golden shares and investment commitments and all that kind of stuff?
So taking the second question first, and look, I don't really speak on specific deals, but the concept of a golden share, if I'm a foreign business, is a terrifying concept. To cede control for such a material investment, or not control, but certain veto rights related to business operations. I mean, why would you do that to yourself? Is the opportunity really that worth it?
That's my question for Nippon Steel. Also, just a quick sidetrack. Is a golden share even legal?
So that I don't know. I'm not a lawyer.
Okay.
So I don't know whether a golden share is legal. From what I've read, there is precedent for the concept. It's just not something that's been done in the U.S.
Yeah.
But it would strike me as a very undesirable outcome from a private sector standpoint to have the U.S. government have a say in your business. And that's not, it's ironic for someone that really hates socialism and communism that to try and basically take government responsibility from a managerial level of a private company, that I think that falls into one of those camps. I'm not an expert.
It would, that would seem to be the assumption, but I don't know.
On the outbound on the investment rules, I haven't seen any sort of update. Remember, we're also waiting on outbound investment rules from a U.S. standpoint, and that's been going back to the last administration, where Secretary Yellen did put forth some standards, but none of that's really, it was focusing on AI and semiconductors and quantum, but the rules and the specificity around it were really vague in the end. So that hasn't been concluded either. I think there's probably a greater appetite for American businesses to get guidance on the outbound investment side than the other way around, but I haven't heard anything along those lines.
Of course.
You've also got to remember, the Treasury Department is pretty depleted. We don't even have a nominee for Undersecretary of International Affairs. So a lot of the political leadership that would generally be in seat now just isn't there in a lot of roles.
Just no nominees or held up in the Senate? Or
no nominees, waiting floor votes. IA is the important one that there isn't even a nominee. That. So you have the people that are anyone who was held over and not kicked out from the last administration running on an interim basis, but they're not able to make any decisions in those roles. They're just seat warmers. And that's a key role relative to the discussion we're having here.
Right, absolutely. So, you work a lot with private companies, and you're obviously trying to help them navigate this. Just generally speaking, what do you tell them? How do you suggest they navigate all of this chaos and uncertainty?
I honestly think this is why you're seeing companies double down on their lobbying efforts in Washington right now. This is obviously an extremely transactional administration. You're seeing a lot of firms invest in record numbers for lobbying, whether in-house or outside support. The advice is honestly not jumping to conclusions. To your point at the onset, the president said this, nothing was written, and nothing has changed. So, I spend a lot of time in the anti-money laundering space, and for months now, this administration is talking about reform and doing things smarter. And so I have clients, I have the chief risk officer of one of the largest banks in the world basically telling me, well, I don't need to spend as much on it being not laundering money for bad people.
Right.
And it's no, actually, no, nothing has actually happened. That is a pronouncement that has not been backed up by anything in writing. And that is the challenge. A lot of it, and a lot of time I spend in the media, is just urging caution when a big announcement is made. Because, he put it out on Truth Social. And he put out an executive order that's almost certainly going to get struck down by the courts, especially this dubious use of IEEPA on the tariff front, which, having worked on IEEPA-based issues for 20 years, is it really a national emergency if you can make a deal so quickly and just lift the tariffs? You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in that argument.
Right. It's a major process mistake. It's a process fumble. Absolutely.
And I do think ultimately when that gets through the Supreme Court, it's going to net out that is the case. I mean, the Court of International Trade is a highly specialized court. The stay that they got to basically allow the president to keep going for the moment, I don't see the Supreme Court overturning such a technical issue. And realistically, he's made the point of what countries can do that have nothing to do with border security or fentanyl. And a trade deficit, you'd be hard-pressed to argue is a national emergency.
Right. And you've already got Section 122 out there, if that's what you're actually worried about. So I get... Yeah, no, sorry, what are you going to say?
No, so, to kind of wrap it up, the companies I'm talking to, is a lot of it's to not make knee-jerk decisions and off the back of this. It's also to
slow down the game,
it's
basically.
He said it, but no one's doing anything. I can talk to friends in the Treasury Department who would be the ones who would literally be putting pen to paper, and it's no one's doing anything. So, I don't know what's actually happening because the people responsible for this just learned about it as well. And that is the challenge, is, just trying to give people steer in that regard. A lot of increased lobbying effort, though, is definitely happening, which is why there's going to be so many carve-outs to some of these policies that are, clearly targeted to whoever was able to get access to the administration and the rear.
So is that the trick, to play the game, go along with the transactional approach? Because, I don't know, I don't like that.
It's a strategy. And look, that's nothing new to Washington. You and I both lived there for years. That is not a foreign concept. It's just...
Oh, no.
It's more blatant.
Never to this magnitude, though. This is orders of magnitude different.
This is different. And I think about when the South African president was in the White House and they got into the argument in the Oval Office. And Ramaphosa says, "I wish I had a plane to give you." And Trump, who didn't even get the joke, was "I wish you did too." And it's no, you're totally missing the point of what he was trying to say. Is Qatar gave you a plane, and now there's all sorts of riches that will be bestowed upon them. It is part of the equation, but I do think it depends on your perspective. If you're an American business versus a foreign business that operates in the U.S. that may look to expand. Trump has been great for creating trade deals that bring people together that don't involve the U.S. Look at Mercosur and the EU that had been pending for 20 years, and all it took was 3 months of Trump. My suspicion, and I spoke at the Milken Institute's global conference in May, the U.S. is not indispensable. And that was the comment that kept coming up on closed-door sessions, because no one really wanted to talk about that publicly. But I think we're about to find out that the U.S. is not indispensable. And that's the thing I don't think this administration fully appreciates.
110% from my perspective. But if I were closer to the Trump administration, I might say, aha, you see, Mercosur and the EU are finally getting their act together. Our coercion worked.
It's fair. It's a fair response. But again, that has nothing to do with the U.S. or doing anything for Americans.
Right.
And you're looking, I think just today, who was it? There were other Latin American countries trying to work on trade deals to try and avoid both the U.S. and China. At the IMF World Bank annual meeting last year, I was with the chairman of a South African bank. And with respect to taking Chinese investment versus U.S. investment, his response is, we'll take capital from anyone. We're not.
Yeah.
And you've got a whole block of countries that fall into that camp where they're not going to play Trump's game, but they're going to do something to attempt to find a balance. But I think the challenge for the private sector is, you've got to protect your business, your reputation, your shareholders. For some, it's staying under the radar. For others, it's trying to do as much as they can, potentially to not involve the U.S. in their supply chain. Because I do think that is inherently the challenge, is the way in which this administration approaches the private sector, can really ruin your week with, some moves that, may be somewhat immaterial in nature, but they're not read that way by the administration.
All right, final question. Here's one to leave it on. What do you anticipate, or do you anticipate that there will be a touch the stove moment where the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, touches that tariff stove and realizes, holy crap, that's hot. I don't want to burn myself?
We passed that on Liberation Day in the weeks that followed. That was the moment. I mean, firstly, we put tariffs on an uninhabited island chain of penguins. So it is kind of hard to take this whole episode seriously when the tariff things that don't even have people or infrastructure. Now, I do think that was the tactical error of looking at the market reaction as a result and what it did to the treasury market in the U.S., to the dollar as a result of those moves. It also, it's kind of laughed off the stage when Besant basically said, we're going to get our allies together and, negotiate against China. It's like, you don't have allies right now because you've alienated all of them. And so I think Liberation Day, and that was very much a manifestation of Peter Navarro's policy, which you don't hear as much of him anymore, I think as a result of that. That was the touch the stove moment. I think they realized they went too far with such a big bang approach, which is why, when we get to the 9th, anyone that is perceived
July
to be
9th,
talking,
when the 90-day window expires.
Anyone that's perceived to be talking with this administration will get a reprieve. Now, the question is those who basically were further down in the queue, like Lesotho, that export most of their apparel manufacturing to the U.S., but are not high up on the radar of this administration. That's the question, is what happens to them? They're willing to negotiate, but you don't care about them enough to talk to them first or even 20th. And so I do think you're going to see a kick the can episode coming up here. But I think we've passed the touch the stove moment. I think Liberation Day and the weeks that followed was the touch the stove moment.
So that's kind of good news and bad news, because we've seen the Trump administration adjust. That's the good news. But the bad news is that what's been left in the wake, the negotiating windows, the various talks, that's kind of baked in now. This is what we've got going forward, and that doesn't seem ideal.
So I think the 10% base tariff is here to stay. That much I feel pretty confident in. And look, we saw him take this approach in the first term. I mean, there is a merit to the argument that the U.S. charges a 2.5% tariff on the importation of European cars. They charge 10% on the importation of American. There are issues there. There are other non-tariff trade barriers that exist. It's just, it always goes back to the approach. He was right on China in the first term, but he lost a lot of people in all the other rhetoric around it.
Yeah.
So I do think glass half full, we might have seen the most extreme scenario, at least through tariffs and the recalibration that's happened as a result of it. Downside is everything's going to cost more money, but that takes time. Will American consumers realize this before the midterm elections? If the Democrats get their act together and actually have leadership, possibly. If it's what we're muddling with today, no. And again, the Democrats won't capitalize on this in the midterms next year because Trump is able to explain these things in a way that people are like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. That is kind of what we're dealing with right now.
Okay, final question related to that point. So my assumption has been, and people have sort of assumed that once the tariffs get into place, any kind of tariff gets into place, consumers see higher prices, they get outraged, they turn against tariffs, they turn against Trump. My theory is that no, you got to pump the brakes on that a little bit because Americans have already been seeing higher prices. I don't assume that they're necessarily going to ascribe higher prices to tariffs or to Trump or anything like that. And I don't know if that whole causal chain is going to hold up the way people assume.
So you may remember there was one large e-com provider that talked about adding a line item in their receipts to lay out tariffs, and Trump lost it. Now, other companies have. My 13-year-old daughter was buying bathing suits from an Australian brand that had a line item for duties, and the bathing suits were $200 and the duties were $350. And like you could see pretty damn clearly where this cost came. More and more providers are beginning to lay that out, because that's the challenge, is if Americans can't attribute the increase to anything specifically, well then, like, is it the tariffs? Is it anything else? It's probably the tariffs, but like they're not really saying that. I do hope that more companies will be more transparent about price increases. I think you've seen some car manufacturers increase prices, not because of tariffs, but because of, and I quote, market conditions. So like if you just say market...
They're not wrong.
They're not wrong, but like market conditions is the new code for tariffs. So just say market conditions and he won't yell at us.
Well, I guess we're going to see how this all plays out. But Dan Tannebaum, thanks very much for joining us today. This has been both grim and fascinating, and I expect our listeners will be much smarter by the time they get to this point. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Ötzi, the 5,300-year-old iceman found frozen and preserved in the Tyrolean region of the Alps on the border between Austria and Italy, has told us a lot about the lifestyles of prehistoric Europeans, what they ate, what they wore, how they traveled, and also how they traded. Among Ötzi's possessions was an axe made of almost pure copper. It's been suggested that Ötzi was involved in copper smelting, given not only the quality of the axe in his possession, but also because of the high levels of copper and arsenic in his hair suggest that he was more than just a sophisticated connoisseur, but also a craftsman. What's particularly interesting about this axe is that while copper was known to have been mined and processed in Ötzi's Alps during his lifetime, the copper used for his axe came from what's now southern Tuscany, which implies some kind of commercial network between Tuscany and the Austrian Alps. This implication was supported by the 2017 discovery of a smaller but similarly designed axe in modern Switzerland that also used Tuscan copper and dates to around the period when Ötzi would have been alive. It's tantalizing to think that Ötzi might have worked the same trade route as this axe, or even that he might have made it himself. We'll probably never know for sure, but Ötzi's legacy remains in the Alps regardless. Genetic testing has revealed that 19 modern Tyrolean men may share Ötzi as a common ancestor. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.